So thank you everyone for coming to the last Co-Integrate talk of this academic year. Before I introduce them, I will say I'm planning next year's Co-Integrate series. So if anybody has any works in progress that you would be interested in sharing through this series, again, it's designed to be a forum for any work that's going on campus related to mathematics education of all grade levels, all research backgrounds. You're welcome to present your work in. It's not, we want these presentations not to be like a conference presentation, but we want them to be very informal, to invite dialogue, to be a venue for works in progress. So I think that we've seen all of the talks that we've had this year have been of that type, and I've been so pleased with the quality and all the good discussion that has come out of these talks. So thanks to everybody who presented in Co-Integrate, thanks to everybody who attended this year in Co-Integrate, and I'm really excited about it. Finishing it off with this talk by a whole team of people who have been working to develop quantitative literacy courses on campus. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to them, and I'll also pass around the sign-in sheet. So if you could sign in, I would really appreciate it. Thanks.
Well, so thanks everybody for coming. Maybe we'll start by introducing ourselves, so you know who we are. And one of the names up there, Ava Edwards, wasn't able to come to the talk today, but he certainly contributed to the development, but also to what we're going to say today. I'm Vince Melfi. I'm a faculty member in statistics and probability, and also director of the program in math education. And I've been involved in quantitative literacy in various ways for about 10 years on campus. Assessment of quantitative literacy of students, taught a pilot course a couple of years ago, and now we've been working really hard this year on developing some courses to be piloted a couple of times this year. Let's see, Dave, next, I forgot about.
Hi everyone, I'm Dave Bramer. I'm faculty here at MSU. I'm the course supervisor for Math 124, which is a survey of calculus, and Math 112, which is finite mathematics. I'm also finishing my doctorate in mathematics. And I think that's everything.
I'm Jeffrey Craig. I'm in program in math education. This is going to be sort of my research trajectory, quantitative literacy, as I go into my dissertation phase.
I'm Andy Krause, because he isn't here, I forgot. I'm a graduate student in the program of math education as well. I'm a second year, so I'm just starting to think about where I'm going, but I'm interested broadly in teaching and learning, especially in this collegiate context, so that's how I fit in.
And I am Amanda Lorenz. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Entomology, which makes me kind of an oddball in this group. But I have a lot of experience teaching ISB labs. I'm the coordinator for ISB 201 Out. And I'm also I don't know if I said, a PhD student. I'm working with Gabe Warding and Julie Labarque.
Super. So let me, and we certainly want discussion today as a big part of what we're doing. So either as we're going to kind of break this up into little chunks and present a little bit, but either as we're presenting or afterwards, we would definitely want to both hear from you and also answer some questions. So I'll talk, just kind of give a brief overview of what we are doing and where this came from. Dave's going to talk a little bit about some challenges of the design that we worked with and more generally with designing this sort of course. Amanda's going to talk about some connections to the integrative studies and biology courses and some resources to add more quantitative content to courses outside of this. Andy's going to talk about one of our decisions to have sort of context drive the mathematics rather than mathematics drive the context. Jeff will talk about some both philosophical and pedagogical considerations that arose as we were doing the development, and then hopefully everyone will join in. I have a little bit of trepidation because the example I'm going to be talking about today is from scaling in biology, and my typical audience would be mathematicians. And so when I said, assume that a mouse is a cube of length 1.1 meters, people would
It's
say,
supposed to be spheres, right?
Sphere cube.
Spherical cow.
Yeah.
Spherical mouse.
So, but we'll see how this goes. So, brief overview of just sort of the history. This group has been heavily involved in development of the upcoming courses, but there's been a lot of history at MSU, and people like Dennis Gilliland and Alla Sikorsky, Pavel Sikorsky, have been really active in assessing students' quantitative literacy over several summer AOP sessions. Mark Voigt in the College of Natural Science has spearheaded the effort to develop these courses and to kind of do the administrative work needed in doing this kind of thing. Yan Wang, the former chair of math, co-taught a pilot course with Dennis and me a few years ago. And many others. Like Doug Eastry, who's the Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education, was one of the authors of the task force report that's referred to here. So lots of people have been involved. We've had a bunch of graduate students, undergraduate students, faculty members who have been working with us over the years. The history is that in 2005, there were actually several task forces set up by then Provost Simon. One was related to quantitative literacy, and their report in 2005 sort of talked about the current context on campus, what was happening in some other places, and then talked about a model for quantitative literacy. And that's kind of driven some of the work that's been done since then. And one of the things that happened pretty quickly after that was trying to get a sense of the quantitative literacy, mainly of incoming students at MSU. So there were assessments of students both at AOP and current students, and we're just now doing some longitudinal follow-ups to kind of get a sense of whether students' quantitative literacy levels change at MSU and hopefully increase. And then, as I said, we did a small pilot course in fall of 2013. So what are we working on kind of administratively? So there are two courses under development. They'll be numbered Math 101 and Math 102, and these will be piloted initially in summer of 2015. And in some sense, that's more a pilot of the materials because it'll be done in the context of Math 110, which is a 5-credit course. And then a larger pilot, which will be in the context we're envisioning for the courses going forward, will happen in fall and spring semesters. And the target audience are undergraduate students in majors which don't have requirements like 3 semesters of calculus or college algebra plus statistics. So students in majors such as English or music or history or others where there aren't specific quantitative requirements. Now, such students are still required to complete a mathematics exit requirement at Michigan State. And so these courses would be another way of fulfilling that exit requirement that hopefully will be a better option in a number of those students. One other thing that was a decision that we spent a lot of time on and has caused us a little bit of grief, but we think it's the right decision, is that these courses won't be a sequence, and so Math 101 won't be a prerequisite for Math 102. I don't want to talk now necessarily about the reasons for that, but if that's a question that people have in discussion time, we can certainly talk about that decision. Some of our decisions that kind of drove the development is that the content, the mathematics, statistics, and computational content is going to be embedded in rich contexts. And some examples are there's going to be a module on health and risk, a module on the natural world, politics and voting, and so on. And a focus is really on using multiple quantitative tools in these settings. So often a stereotypical course in mathematics or statistics, sort of you're presented with a mathematical topic, and then lots of problems where that specific mathematical technique is used to solve problems. And one of the things we're really aiming for is helping students understand that in a typical context, you need to bring many different quantitative tools to bear. Not only mathematics, not only statistics, not only computing, but drawing from all of those areas. I think a quote that fits in with our view is one by Memstein, where he says that quantitative literacy involves sophisticated reasoning with elementary mathematics more than elementary reasoning with sophisticated mathematics. In some sense, that's what we're aiming for. We've also thought a lot about the kind of structure of the course and pedagogy, and I think Jeff will talk more about that a little bit later. But the course, so the structure of the course going forward will be 2 meetings per week, 75 minutes each. One will be a large lecture of about 200 students, and the recitations with about 30 students. And both in the large meeting and in the smaller meetings, we're going to engage the students in active learning, engage them as much as possible in discussion, and student projects are going to be a focus. So students are really going to be asked to not only compute answers, but to discuss, to present their work. And if you do that in class, but then the exams are multiple choice sort of computational problems, then students quickly learn going to classes is such a good idea. So our assessment also will include discussion projects in addition to some more traditional homework exams. And another way of stating our goal is that we really want students to have some tools, but also the dispositions to reason quantitatively, both in their majors and as citizens. So many students, when asked about mathematics and statistics, don't think of those as tools that are really relevant in their everyday lives or in their majors, and I don't think we'll change that dramatically. We hope that the students will leave the course with a little bit more appreciation for the utility and in some sense the beauty of the subjects. So there are 2 examples I prepared to kind of give you a sense of the kinds of contexts we're going to be talking about. I'm not going to cover the first example, which was on kind of the health and risk and the risks and benefits of mammography for detecting breast cancer. Instead, we'll talk about Godzilla. And so in the most recent movie, Godzilla was portrayed as a creature that was about 100 meters tall. The picture I've got there is actually from the original 1954 movie, but I like the picture better. But he was, I think, 30 meters tall then, which is still pretty big. And so a question is, could a terrestrial animal of that size actually exist? And so we could ask students to think about this, and there are lots of different ways of thinking about this. One obvious one is, a 100-meter animal is going to be pretty heavy, and how strong would the sort of structure needed to hold up that animal have to be? So we can think about weight and skeletal strength. There's going to be a lot of blood pumping through this animal, so we could think about blood pressure. Another thing to think about is just heat buildup. So we all generate heat, and we dissipate heat in various ways, and so would that be a problem for such a big animal, and so on. And that's the one I'll think about a little bit. So here's where we get to the mathy stuff. I've got
The part where he breathes fire, that doesn't bother me.
that doesn't, no.
The heat buildup.
That's how you.
He's dissipating heat.
So we with students we could talk about the fact that heat is generated in cellular processes, and somehow that heat has to be lost or burst into flame. And so the sort of surface area is related to how easily heat can be lost. And we know, and students will discover if they don't know, that surface area grows more slowly than volume as organisms grow. And so here's where, as a mathematician, I think, okay, let's just think of Godzilla or a mouse as a cube, and that makes life easier. And of course there are, and Amanda could talk more about this, but there are, reasons why we aren't cubic or spherical or whatever, but to kind of think about just the general, the relationship between volume and surface areas, it's useful to think in terms of simple structures. So with a cube, the volume is just the length of the cube, and the surface area is 6 times the length squared. And so if we think of a mouse, so about maybe that long, the length would be about 1/10 of a meter, and the volume would be 0.001 meters cubed, and so the surface area to volume ratio would be 60. And so that kind of somehow reflects the sort of the volume is the heat being generated, and the surface area is the allowed heat to be lost. And if we think about Godzilla then, so the our 100-meter cubic Godzilla would have a surface area to volume ratio of 0.06. So rather than 60 units of surface area per unit of volume, we've got less than 1 per unit of volume. And so there's a lot of heat being generated, and there's not a lot of surface area allowing that heat to be dissipated. And poor Godzilla is the best I could do with graphics. I wanted him to be bursting into flames. So in just thinking about this kind of question, we would be thinking already about geometry, about algebra, and then if we think a little bit more about these kinds of scaling relationships, where different relationships between different sort of quantities scale as organisms scale, and the examples are brain mass and body mass, wing length and flight speed, circumference of trunks and heights of trees, and so on and so on. And kind of thinking about the mathematical tools that we want students to be bringing to bear in these kinds of questions. So some algebra shows that we can relate surface area to volume. Surface area is 6 times volume to the 2/3 power. And then by taking logarithms, we linearize that relationship. And so that allows us then to think about maybe estimating this exponent from data. And so we can collect some data, we can fit a line to the data using these squares, and then we can use the slope of the line as an estimate of that exponent. And in fact, in thinking about, this is about the limit of my scientific knowledge, but in thinking about the relationship between metabolic rate and body mass, the sort of theory suggests that the exponent should be 2/3, but the data suggests that the exponent should be 3/4, and at least as I understand it, there's still controversy about this, or is that settled biologically? Not sure. Okay. Well, but an interesting aspect of all of this for the students is both, there's sort of the mathematical tools, and so now we're talking about logarithms, we're talking about fitting a line to data, we're talking about the fact that all the points don't lie on the line, so there's this error involved. But then also we're talking a little bit about the relationship between theory and empirical data in science, in all fields. And so sort of theory suggests that the exponent should be 2/3, the data suggests it should be 3/4, and how do we reconcile those things? So the point of this example is just that in a context like this, we can hopefully get students interested. So hopefully choose contexts where students will find them compelling and will find it interesting to investigate on their own. But also we can bring to bear all sorts of different mathematical and statistical and computational tools that are really important in helping us to understand these contexts. And just knowing a little statistics without knowing anything about algebra and geometry doesn't do us a lot of good here. Just knowing geometry without knowing anything about data doesn't do us any good here. Really, most of the contexts that we face in our fields or in our lives, we really need to have sort of multiple mathematical and computational statistical tools at our behest. And I think I just said that, and so I'm going to turn this over to Dave.
So I just wanted to, kind of on a different tact, just briefly go over some of the different challenges we faced, and not so much I'm going to try not to answer how we resolved those, just so I can get through them in a decent amount of time and kind of let you guys think about them, and if you want to talk about those afterwards, I thought that would be a good place for that. So when we were thinking about the pedagogy of the course, this is kind of a unique course because not only do we have to kind of think about what is quantitative literacy and define those learning objectives, but we also have to think about our audience. So Vince mentioned that these are basically non-STEM students, and I believe you mentioned this is for most of them will be their last course. It'll be a terminal course for them in mathematics. So what kind of things do we want to impart on them before they go? What kind of tools, especially considering what their backgrounds will be. And kind of along that same track, how do we kind of create a cohesive narrative and theme for this course as we develop it, especially when we're trying to cover all of these kind of different types of things, social science, life science, et cetera. So we decided early on that we wanted to, as Vince was just discussing, go from context to content, which is kind of opposite of traditional math courses. And so this presented a really unique challenge for me, and I think for all of us. We kind of experienced just how difficult that was to just start with a context and then boil down and find the content there. So that was a special challenge for us, and I thought that was something if people wanted to talk about would be nice. I remember what I had for learning goals. All right. Well, let me think about that. So for there are learning goals. So for assessment, again, we wanted to take consideration of traditional math courses many times have just a lot of high stakes assessment, and so we wanted to take that into consideration and have a variety of different assessment techniques. But that's a challenge because this is going to be a large lecture course, and as Ben said, we wanted to incorporate active learning throughout. So that means kind of forums, projects, things like this. And so we had to kind of figure out how we're going to implement that and also how we're going to go about assessing those things. That was my, still don't really know what I was going to say about learning. So I think that was what I was thinking about with, I don't know. So for the textbook, we had to really think about, do we want to use existing materials or create our own, and how would the students push back on that if we don't use a textbook. So what we decided upon was to use the Bennett and Briggs text, the quantitative literacy text, as a scaffold. But even so, using that, we're not using it in a linear way, and there are also modules where we're just creating our own original material. So that diverges from the book completely in some of the modules. So we really have to try to think about how the students are going to react to that and how we're going to move from that. Eventually we want to move to creating our own either textbook or at least course pack, so that's been a challenge as well. So there's also this issue of scale, which I kind of mentioned before. So how do we scale all of these ideas up for large lecture versus just these small lectures, which originally I think when we first started talking about these ideas, we all had in mind small, 30 people size classes. So that's been a big challenge as well. And then when we do develop these things, Andy and Jeff here will pilot the summer session, but after that we'll be handing this off to probably a new faculty, I believe. And so how do we, in addition to just the materials we developed, how do we really communicate all of the ideas we have about the course and pass those on to the instructor, especially if any of us are gone. So that was all I had for that, and if I remember the learning goal stuff, I'll come back to that.
Okay, so I thought I would talk a little bit about some of the quantitative content that we integrate into our ISP labs and how that can tie in well with the quantitative content in these new QL courses. So Vince already talked about scaling and surface to volume ratio. In my ISP lab that I teach, we talk about surface to volume ratio, but we set it within the context of insects. So here's an example of a flashy context with some quantitative components. So to give you a little background, insects are limited by their size and distribution by different factors. And one of those factors is their surface to volume ratio. So as the size of a shape increases, its surface to volume ratio decreases. And as surface to volume ratio decreases, so you have less surface area relative to the amount of volume, it becomes harder for insects, which are exothermic, so they take their heat from the environment, they can't regulate their own body temperature. It's very hard for large insects to, with their small surface relative to their large volume, to be able to collect enough heat from the environment to make it all the way inside that giant volume. And so this is one of the reasons why you only find the largest insects in the tropics near the equator, where it's warm all the time and they don't have to warm up. Versus in Michigan, our largest insect, or one of our largest insects, is that toe biter. That's a temperate insect, is about this long. They're aquatic, and they do have a nasty bite, so be careful if you're in a wetland. But I mean, it's only the length of my finger, right? And so the longest insect in the tropics, besides walking sticks, is the longhorn beetle. It's Titanius giganticus, and that guy's hand, I'm sure, is bigger than mine. But they can get up to almost a foot long, which is pretty crazy. And so I think it's really interesting to use these quantitative concepts to help to explain to the students, this is how the world works. This is how nature works. And so that's one of the things that got me really excited about participating in this group. To give you one more example of how we try to embed quantitative content in our courses, we have the students investigate caloric content of different foods in a nutrition lecture. So we have them do calorimetry, which is a technique to estimate how many calories are in a food item. We have them compare Doritos and crickets. And we talk about eating insects and feed to meat ratios and things like that. So I think there's just so much opportunity for alignment between these QL courses and our ISP or ISP lecture and lab courses. And so talking about that, continuing that theme, one of the things that I was really curious about as we were going through this process is how are these new courses going to impact potentially what we teach in our ISP or integrated studies courses. And so basically, from what I can understand, ISP, ISE, and ISP, all of these courses currently have a math prerequisite or a co-requisite, and the students can choose like Math 103, Math 110, I think. And then these two QL courses would act as another option for their prerequisite or co-requisite. And I think another thing that ties these classes in well with our integrative studies program is that the emphasis, like we've been saying, is on rich and relevant context. And especially when you're working with non-majors, one of the major challenges that I've come up with is trying to engage students in the material. But if you can show them a context that's relevant to them, they're much more likely to have an interest. And that's something that we try to do in integrative studies a lot. And then the other question I had was, so what does this mean for us as integrative studies instructors? And I think that an important direction would be curricular alignment between these courses. So what skills are students learning in QL that can be applied to a richer, broader understanding of other concepts that we talk about in our classes. And I also asked these guys to suggest some resources for non-math people like me who are interested in increasing the quantitative content in their classes, and they gave me some good recommendations. The Bennett and Briggs textbook is the green one. That one's really good. It's really friendly. Even if you're not a math person, it's not scary. How Not to Be Wrong is another good one. And The Heart of Mathematics is another good one that's been recommended. And then there's also a website called gapminder.org that some of you might be familiar with that allows you to explore graphical relationships and correlation and causation, things like that.
All right, I'm just going to quickly talk about our tension between taking a mathematical idea and finding context, and taking a context and sort of pulling the mathematical ideas out of it, because that's been a conversation that has come up quite often. And so sort of the traditional approach to thinking about applied problems is you take a mathematical idea and you develop that mathematical idea sort of abstractly, and then sort of at the end you tack on several different applications of that mathematical idea. And one problem with that is the complexity of transfer, that students will be able to take that abstract idea and then apply it to sort of concrete examples, and that's not as straightforward as we would like it to be, unfortunately. So what we've tried to do is instead take these rich contexts, and we can explain some more of the context if you have questions about that, and consider these contexts with a more broad quantitative lens. And what that means is that instead of taking one specific mathematical tool and exploring one specific context, that's all or multiple contexts using that one tool, we take this one broad context and think about a bunch of different mathematical ideas sort of comprehensively, and how that gives us information about the context that is somehow inseparable from the context. So it's really part of it, and sort of the social or political context can't be removed from the mathematical content. They're bound together. An example of this is so if we want to consider exponential growth, the way that might be done in a college algebra class is you talk about exponential growth and what an exponential model is, and then you say, okay, exponential growth could be applied to population growth, or exponential decay as in like carbon dating, or in finance as in compounding interest. And then you hope that that abstract idea can be applied by students to all these contexts. What we're trying to do with exponential growth is we don't ever have an exponential growth unit. Instead, we have a bunch of different contexts, and exponential growth might come out of those contexts. So when we're talking about population growth as a broad problem, exponential growth is part of that, as well as other quantitative content. Exponential growth will come up again when we talk about things like the Ebola outbreak, and we're talking about mathematical modeling of disease and things like that. So it comes up more laterally as opposed to being a focus for a short time. And this is really, really hard to do, because sort of the way that we have, any of us who have had some experience with math in the sort of traditional sense, is we think of cool mathematical ideas and then we look for ways that we can apply them, which is a little bit, that can lead to contrived problems as opposed to really authentic problems. So it's hard to get out of that mode and to instead think about what's an interesting problem, and then trying to think about how we would use our quantitative knowledge to think about that problem. So trying to model that is a real challenge that we face. I think Jeff can talk about that a little more specifically with this next example.
Yeah, it had to be difficult, and I put in clicks, so yeah, I'll do that. I'll try to go quickly so we have some time. I know we're a little delayed. I took Vince's advice about this presentation about sort of what have we learned individually, and I wanted to put forward some things that I've been thinking about. So we've been talking a lot about students as our primary thing, right? So we're starting with students and then moving to this course. So one thing that came to our really front of our discussions is that students already know about a lot of the modules that we talk about, if not all of them. So social issues, physical issues. So as an integrated studies kind of conceptualization of quantitative literacy, we're going to foreground the quantitative but not remove or abstract from the context. So we're trying to understand quantitative literacy as a lens to think about big issues rather than as an isolated need that people have to have this to participate in a particular way. And another sort of goal of quantitative literacy is so-called critical stance towards quantitative information. So a sort of consideration going forward is, well, will students be critical quantitatively if we tell them to be? And so you may already have answers to that in your mind, but I'll get there. So we're thinking about what students already know about our context. And we're thinking, well, can we kind of embrace that idea and look for far-reaching questions? So this was a piece that I took from a document that got mailed to me by the MAA, and it was a life insurance policy, and this statement was the first line. So in this day and age, there's no such thing as being too safe. And as I've been thinking with this quantitative literacy hat on for so long, I just thought, wow, that is such a quantitative question to me. You put forward this statement, it's something people have strong opinions and thoughts and feelings about, but there is a quantitative aspect that could be foregrounded about that statement. And so we've been sort of trying to replicate that thought in a lot of our modules, so these are a couple of them. So economics is a module, we're thinking about economic decision making. Science, natural science as a module, what sort of knowledge counts in science? These are big questions that have a quantitative lens to them. Government, what is politically fair, and everything that comes with that students already know about it. And we're just going to try to superimpose a lens of quantitative on top of this. So this goes to this idea that quantitative literacy gets talked about often as a quote need, and some people know that I fight with this word a lot. So it's not necessarily a need in my opinion, but it is useful. So it's not a need to participate in these modules in thoughtful ways that you look at them with a quantitative lens, but it is helpful to have a quantitative lens at your disposal. So I think this sort of is the type of thing that we're leveraging with our students. Students know about it, and we're going to introduce some other ideas to considering these problems. So as an example, economics, the first day of economics, we're bringing forward a definition of economics, one definition. And as you see, I bulleted this out because the activity is going to be that each of these bullets will be on an individual poster, and groups of 4 in the recitation will see only one piece of the poster. And their activity will be to say, how is this related to economics in your view? So if you see to produce goods and services, they'll have to describe, and this is the opening to the module, so really leveraging what students already know. So what does bringing quantitative to the foreground look like? Well, 2 ways. So limited resources is one, in our opinion, major quantitative lens that we can take towards this definition. Another, alternative uses, so making choices, and what quantitatively that looks like. So, in the module, as we proceed in the lessons, we introduce game theory as a way to consider choice making, decision making, and we introduce cost-benefit analysis as a way to think about limited resources and alternatives. But we don't do so uncritically, so we want students to have sort of a critical thought process towards the quantitative lens. So what does that look like in practice for us? Well, We have a lesson at one point where we reapproach game theory and examine the ways that it's limited, or the ways it could be complexified in terms of what we're thinking about. So for instance, in the early applications that our students will be dealing with in game theory and economics, there won't be an obvious use of marginal cost and benefit. The idea that a dollar is not worth the same to everyone is sort of clouded by some of the early game theory we'll be doing. And cost-benefit analysis, similarly, what are we sort of missing? Well, not easily measured benefits and costs. Things like externalities and public goods from economics. So we have a sort of long-term in our materials, a thought process about what we want students to have dispositionally as a critical stance. This is a quote from Giroux. He's talking about literacy and about how this is positioning me and Andy for in the summer when we're trying to teach this for the first time. What are we going to do? So we have materials, but we can implement them in vastly different ways. And we want to not necessarily do things that run counter to our goals. So we do not necessarily want to be the authority on what makes a good statistical study and what makes a bad statistical study. So we're going to be looking at balancing sort of our long-term goals with imposing the knowledge that we have or the values that we have as far as what happens in the classroom. So we're working towards being facilitators of critical discussions, including being modelers, but not being the only authority of what gets accepted. And so I think that's the last slide, and it's probably useful because we're going to be teaching it in the summer, so that's what we're trying to think about. That's all I have.
So there are a lot of aspects to this course development, and there are, the sort of logistical aspects. There are questions about how it will interact with other courses on campus, like integrative studies. There are questions of assessment, questions of content, questions of the choices we've made in terms of context, driving content, and things like that. Please jump in about anything.
So I got the big picture that this is scientific literacy, but I'd actually be interested in hearing a little bit more about the specific learning goals.
Quantitative literacy.
Sunday afternoon, I'm drinking my coffee. So I'd like to know a little bit more about, so I got the big picture of quantitative literacy, but I'd like to, can we get a little bit deeper in what are the specific learning goals? And
So I also remembered what I wanted to say, which may help. And maybe Vince can probably talk more about it, but MSU did a study about kind of what the university wanted in regards to a quantitative literacy course.
Well, so yes, to some extent the learning goals were driven by the task force report from 2005, which talked about both specific kind of topics in mathematics, statistics, and computing, but then also student dispositions towards using quantitative methods in context. And so the learning goals are really both addressing both of those kind of areas. So there's some mathematical, what's called mathematical, some mathematical content that will be part of the learning goals, but then also for example, the projects and the discussions will be focused more on students' interpretation, students' ability to discuss in context. Looks like I'm not answering your question, or?
well, yeah, I still get the big picture of it, but I'd like to know a little bit more about, so for me, knowing like what a specific learning goal is drives like what I do in a class. It drives what the context is going to be. It drives what my assessment's going to be, and that's why I was just sort of curious about what the set looks like.
Mhm.
But it's okay. I mean,
Yeah, so each of our modules, our modules are like the context-specific thing. Those each have a little more specific learning goals. So I worked on a module that deals with voting and political systems a little bit, and the learning goals of that module are to understand things like how do different voting systems affect how decisions are made, or how do different ways to draw districting lines affect how you interact with your government, and things like that. So the overall goal there, the maybe overarching goal of that module is how do we make decisions as a community, maybe, in a quantitative way. That's just one module, though.
Yeah, and so in specific modules, we have specific learning goals. The health and risk module, we look at, and so there are, questions of like, we want students to understand the relevance of base rate when you're testing for diseases. We want students to understand things like lead time bias and thinking about effectiveness of screening programs. So is that kind of getting closer to what you're looking for?
Vince, I think another way to ask it would be, is there a framework for the whole course that you're sharing with the students that sort of organizes these ideas for them?
Yeah, and that's still under construction. So that's something we're working with as we develop the materials.
I mean, I'll make one up. I would say something like looking for patterns in data to make decisions might be a learning goal. And you could apply that maybe in a biological situation, you could apply that in a political sense, but to me that would be sort of like a, I don't know if that's what you want every college student to know, but that's like a general learning goal that from a quantitative sense, I would want kids to be able to look, people to be able to look for patterns and know why something is a significant pattern rather than just a, maybe not even a meaningful trend. Like how do you make those kind of decisions? So when I think of quantitative literacy, but I'm not a mathematician or anything, so I'm just making it all up on the fly. I would want to think of things like that, right? What are some very specific things that I would want a kid leaving my class, a student leaving my class would be able to do quantitatively, right? So I want to increase the quantitative thinking ability of students, and I would assume you would have, this is the framework that Joyce is thinking about, that there's some major things, right? So one could be, how do you make a decision if this pattern is significant over this pattern? Why would I make a decision on that? And I think that would be a quantitative literacy thing. I don't know, I'm not a quantitative literacy person. That's why I was asking you, what are your learning goals? Because I think it's interesting.
Sure. So that's I mean, Andy and I were talking about maybe more narrow learning objectives, and so you're talking about kind of broader overarching learning goals for the course.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation because we've had a lot of discussions about what our broad learning goals are. I know early on that was the primary focus because it sort of centered what we were going to do for the next several months. And we've revisited it, but I'm not sure that we've fully settled on a list of 5 or 6 that are really central. But I think listening to you, what you've said, absolutely is close to, if not identical to, one of the ideas that we have as a learning goal. That to be sort of conscious of making decisions with quantitative data and what do studies that are good look like and studies that are bad look like is a goal. How we reach that goal is some of what I was trying to talk about at the end.
Yeah, so in part of the process that we've gone through, and as you know, these are all kind of iterative processes around, I don't know, November or so, we got together and focused on trying to come up with a tentative list of big ideas, sort of. So what are for each of the courses, 6 or 7 big ideas that we would like students to leave with, and those have driven what we're doing now. But I'm hesitant to say that we have completed that work.
Well, that's great. So do you have this list of big ideas?
We do.
We have many lists.
I mean, I don't have it to hand right now, but yes, we do.
I think you do. I hesitate to interrupt, but I think the big learning goal is the one you identified at the very beginning, which I think is fabulous, which was the pragmatic definition of what quantitative literacy is. I mean, isn't that the big goal?
What's the big goal? What other? I was trying to get at the sub goal.
Yeah, so I think he was getting at, okay,
Right.
that's the biggie, but what are some of the?
But that's that's your big goal, right? Enabling the math-phobic student to use math to solve problems. And boy, I mean, if you can do that, and that's certainly what we're facing with the science-focused students and trying to define scientific literacy. So I like that as this overarching theme to the course, and I applaud it.
Yeah, but that can't drive lesson development, right? It can't drive lesson development, it can't drive assessment development. That's sort of your big
I would
objective for the
disagree.
course, but how are you going to know if you meet that?
Well, that's the question. How are you going to know?
Yeah, that was my question.
So one of
What is
the,
assessment?
I don't know if anyone else wants to. One of the things that we're incorporating for every module is a prediction task. So we're going to assess where the students are. So Jeff said they already know about these ideas. So we're going to give them a quiz. 100-person world is a module we have, and it scales all sorts of different demographic factors worldwide to if there were only 100 people, how many would know how to read, how many would have water. Maybe you've seen this kind of infographic. And so for this module, the prediction task is to we kind of explain to them what this is, but we don't show them this infographic. And we say, okay, how many people would have electricity and have these things, do this task. And then we kind of hit this with the quantitative lens and dig deeper into it using these ideas, and then afterwards kind of retest it and see, ask them these questions, what changed, why did it change, etc.
Other things that are included in the assessment are like participation in D2L discussion forums, which is more interpretive. So if you have this quantitative data, we give them an article, you have to just participate in this discussion and learn how to engage in a quantitatively oriented discussion in productive ways. And you can't necessarily grade that the same way you grade like a traditional math quiz, but participation in that sort of event is learning in some way in its own right.
Well, and put another way, I mean, I think the question of how do we know whether students are achieving some of these overall goals, we expect, as Jeff said, that most of the context will be familiar to the students. So when we talk about mammography screening for breast cancer, and students are familiar with various sorts of screening procedures, and initially we will ask students to talk about their understanding of those kinds of procedures, and what we expect is that they will be looking at those things somewhat anecdotally. So I have a relative who was screened for breast cancer and they found the cancer and she's fine, or my parent was screened for prostate cancer, but he developed it 3 years later anyway. So sort of, kind of anecdotal views of how to think about those, and then as we move through a module on a particular topic, and as we move through the course, we will expect students to what Jeff would call use a more quantitative lens on these kinds of questions. So when you're thinking of screening, there's an infographic. There's an infographic from Science News related to mammography and sort of if 10,000 50-year-old women get annual mammograms for 10 years, what will happen to those 10,000 women? And initially, a student might look at this and see the numbers and maybe focus on 10 lives will be saved out of 10,000, and sort of very, very naive quantitative view of this. Once students understand things about testing and about base rates and positive predictive value and things like that, they'll have a much better understanding of the transitions in this diagram, and hopefully a better understanding both of, for themselves, does screening make sense, and does age matter? Yes, it matters, because the base rate is dependent on age. And then as a question for society, is screening something that is, should be recommended, thinking about sort of the trade-offs and what happens to people who have false positives, again with a quantitative focus. So I think that to some extent, is the development of students' willingness and ability to approach a question in science, in society, in health, whatever, quantitative. And I think that you know, based on experience and based on some research, that students will initially be reluctant to bring quantitative tools to bear, will be reluctant to understand that these quantitative tools don't give the answer. This is a place where there isn't an answer, and there's still a lot of controversy about screening for mammography. And so that's, to some extent, one way that we can assess their learning.
So it's past 4 o'clock now, but we did start a little late, so I think we have some, I mean, you know, if you need to leave, nobody will be upset, but I think we can take a couple more questions.
So, when Paul Cobb and Kate McLean started working on statistics, they were determined to put their, you know, to deal with rich biological contexts as the location for their work. And what they found is that they were ending up spending most of their time teaching biology and little of their time teaching statistics. And they ended up concluding we have to simplify the context in order to get to the math, which was plenty complicated in and of itself. And you know, as I listen to what you're talking about here, I worry that that's a problem you run into. You know, like for the surface area to volume ratio, you're going to be working with students who don't conserve matter and energy. And you know, so what does it mean to, you know, think about distribution of heat if you think heat can kind of appear or disappear depending on the circumstances? And you know, convincing students that there are some ways in which shape matters and other ways in which shape doesn't matter. And when you think about surface area to volume ratio, how do you help them understand that in this particular case, that ratio is not very dependent on shape? Whereas, you know, so anyway, I just wonder about the ratio you're going to end up with of teaching about the context to teaching about the mathematics.
Yeah, and we've struggled with that too. And the other issue is that none of us is an expert in certainly all of these contexts. Some of us are experts in none of these contexts. And so there certainly, I mean, we talk about rich context and we mean that, but obviously kind of what a student learns about scaling in an ISB course will be very different from what a student learns in a course like ours. And there will be, I mean, in this case of thinking about screening and risks, there's going to be a lot of simplification compared to the reality on the ground. But we would like students to have a little bit more sophistication than sort of anecdotal.
I would say that your concern is really valid. It spoke to me because revisiting the economics module, one of the things I sort of recognized was that I was teaching economics. And so to recenter game theory, sort of the quantitative things, expected value, as the way that we're going to talk about these things, even well acknowledging that there are other ways to talk about them.
And we're seeing them as kind of these quantitative techniques as kind of tools, right, for future evaluation of situations. And I know that you guys were going to do like quite a bit of quantitative assessment too in the math lab, and so the students will be working on math problems in addition to the context.
And Jack, I'll get you in a second just to kind of follow up. I mean, there are several pilots that are going to happen, and I want to say a little bit about the timing of all this. So we started this work around the end of summer of 2014, and Mark Voigt talked to Doug, who talked to provost, who said, and at that time our plan was that the pilots would occur in fall of 2016 and spring of 2017. and June said, that's a great idea. Can you do it faster? And so we are rushing. I mean, we're on a bit of a rush timeline, and so to some extent, you know, we've been hitting ideas like learning objectives and then bouncing back to, but we have to get something in place. And it's, nothing in the world is kind of comes from an ideal, got lots of time. And so I'm hoping though that the pilot will really give us some good feedback about things like the context and how those have to be thought of. And I'm expecting that the course that's taught this fall will be substantially different than the course that's taught the fall of 2016. Jack, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I had a reaction that was similar to Andy's. I really like it. I really like the conception. I think it's ambitious. It's actually asking kids to think. What an idea. But it flies in the face of what most of our freshmen are coming into Michigan State expecting of an MTH class. So you're asking them to model, and they don't know how to model. You're asking them to address problems, and they're not used to solving problems. You're asking them to step into situations that don't have definite answers, but that's what they've known mathematics is about. So I'm mostly thinking about Andy and Jeff because I know them. I have feelings for them. I don't want them to come out with arrows sticking out of them, but anything you can do to prepare students for what's about to happen to them because their expectations are not aligned with what they're going to see. So anything you can do to get them ready for this is going to be a different math experience would be useful to do.
Do either of you want to speak to that, or?
Yeah, we've definitely thought about that a lot. We're trying to do a couple of different things. We're taking some extra effort to be deliberate about how we organize things for students. So for example, like for each module, it won't just be assignments randomly. At the beginning, they'll get, these are the assignments that you're going to do, and these are how they'll tie in. And then sort of trying to come back to the same types of assignments, so they'll have a little bit of online homework that'll be more like math type homework. And then for every module, they'll have discussion questions. And so it's sort of having a repetitive structure that goes through each maybe 4 to 6 week unit is how we've our first attempt at trying to.
And you're thinking of that as a more familiar structure that they would recognize and say, oh, okay, I know what to do in this structure.
Yeah, trying to make it really obvious what they should be doing on each particular day. Like these are the types of activities, and that's not going to be a math class every second. You're doing that's embedded within the other things that you're doing.
Well, I think the interesting thing is
But math
it is going to be a math class. It's just not going to be a math class like they've ever seen that.
Yeah.
Or
So I want to riff on what Jack was just saying though, and I had a question about the space in your curriculum because I didn't know if you were thinking about giving students any opportunities to speak to the kinds of contexts that they would be interested in investigating, because I think like if you pick out any, I think high school boys with this, but sports fan, when they talk about the stats of their favorite player, they're doing so much mathematics in their kind of fandom. So that could be a particular context or draft picks or something like that. That's something that they are doing. They are thinking about those sorts of problems very quantitatively, but you know, it's not it's in their world. That's not math, if that makes any sense. So I didn't know if you were planning to.
Yes, I think in the trajectory of this course development, one thing Andy and I were talking about for the summer in the pilot is actually crafting space to hopefully do what, because we're trying to get daily feedback, what students are going to say, well, love to talk about this. So that's one thing, and then the other is just the process of piloting to really see what sort of context students are like, no, don't do this anymore, and the ones that they like. Hopefully be able to react, yeah.
So I think having this course be different than the traditional math course, and contextualizing the quantitative literacy is pretty exciting, frankly. To be handed a skill or trained in a skill and then actually be shown why this is worthwhile and why this is useful immediately instead of this is a skill Now you have the skill, who cares? But if I have a skill and I understand why it's a value in a greater context, I think it's pretty exciting. And I do want to say that I'm glad that June has asked you to speed up the process. This is coincident with in the secondary grade studies, we're kind of trying to normalize our lab programs and elevate the degree by which QL is being embedded. So I view this as a great opportunity for us, frankly. So we're going to kind of benefit because once this is well established, we can now align our lab programs with what's happening in this course. And we can count on, oh, most of our students are going to have these skills that they've learned contextually, and we can now use them in our lab programs. And that's going to be a really nice thing across undergrad education in Michigan State. So that's going to be powerful. So we're excited.
So with that question, I'd actually like to thank everybody for attending. Thank you for your comments. Thanks to the presenters for a really interesting. That next year, maybe around this time even, you might come back and share what you found in the pilot. That would be pretty cool. Anyways, again, please do come talk to me if you would like to present and co-integrate next year. And have a good summer. I'll see you again in the fall.